Greetings, wanderers. Tonight, we drift back to the medieval world, where entertainment was a curious blend of the sacred and the savage, the delightful and the deadly. From blood-soaked spectacles that drew cheering crowds to innocent games that could spark village-wide riots, medieval people knew how to have fun in ways that might leave us both fascinated and horrified. If you find comfort in these gentle explorations of history's stranger corners, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if it feels right for you. And before you drift too deep into the past, do leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to know how these old stories find you in your corner of the world. Now, let us settle in, dim the lights, and step together into a time when a good time might cost you your life, but boredom was never an option. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in 1387. And you're walking through the town square when you hear the town crier announcing that there will be a public execution at noon. Instead of feeling horrified, you feel excited. You might even cancel your afternoon plans. This was medieval entertainment at its most popular, and if that sounds disturbing to our modern ears, well, you're about to discover just how different medieval fun really was. Public executions were the blockbuster movies of the Middle Ages. People didn't just stumble upon them by accident. They planned their entire day around watching someone die. Mothers packed lunches for the family. Vendors set up stalls selling ale, bread, and roasted nuts. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. The whole community treated execution day like we treat the Super Bowl. The more dramatic the method, the bigger the crowd. A simple hanging might draw a modest audience, but a beheading? That was premium entertainment. If someone was sentenced to be drawn and quartered, the whole countryside would turn out. People traveled for miles, some walking for days, just to witness the spectacle. Innkeepers raised their prices. Local merchants saw their best sales of the month. What's truly fascinating is how these events became teaching moments wrapped in entertainment. Parents brought their children not just for the thrill, but to show them what happened to people who broke the law. It was like a very extreme version of Scared Straight. "See what happens when you steal bread, little Thomas," they'd whisper as the executioner raised his axe. The condemned person became a kind of celebrity in their final moments. If they died bravely, making a good speech or showing no fear, they could become folk heroes. People would retell their last words for years. If they begged and cried, well, that was entertaining too, just in a different way. Either way, their final performance would be discussed in taverns for months. Sometimes the execution itself became a form of dark comedy. If the executioner was having an off day and needed multiple swings of the axe, the crowd might actually boo his poor performance. Imagine getting heckled while trying to do your job as the town executioner. "Come on, Harold, my grandmother swings harder than that." Medieval crowds were not known for their patience or sensitivity. But executions were just the opening act in the medieval spectacle show. Bear baiting was another crowd favorite that combined animal cruelty with gambling in ways that would make modern people sick to their stomachs. Picture a large brown bear chained by the neck or leg to a wooden post in the center of a ring. Now picture a pack of specially trained dogs released to attack this bear, while hundreds of people cheer and place bets on the outcome. The bear, despite being chained, was still a formidable opponent. These weren't teddy bears we're talking about. A full-grown bear could kill several dogs before being overwhelmed, and sometimes the bear actually won. When that happened, the crowd went wild. Nothing got medieval blood pumping quite like an underdog victory, even when the underdog was a literal bear. Bear baiting rings were permanent fixtures in many English towns. The most famous was in London, where the bear gardens drew crowds from across the social spectrum. Rich merchants sat alongside poor laborers, all united in their desire to watch animals tear each other apart. Some bears became so famous they had names and devoted followings. People would ask specifically to see Sackerson or Harry Hunks perform, as if they were going to see their favorite band play. The economics around bear baiting were surprisingly complex. Professional bear keepers bred and trained both the bears and the dogs. They traveled from town to town with their animals, setting up temporary rings wherever they could draw a crowd. The best bear keepers became wealthy, and their most successful bears were valuable assets. A good fighting bear could earn its owner the equivalent of several years' wages for a common laborer. Bull baiting followed similar rules, but with an even more dangerous animal. Bulls were either chained to stakes or held in place while dogs attacked them. The bulls would toss dogs into the air with their horns, sometimes killing them instantly, sometimes sending them flying into the crowd. This was considered part of the fun. If a dog landed on a spectator, people laughed. If someone got gored by a bull that broke free, that was just the price of admission to medieval entertainment. Cockfighting brought gambling to an even more intense level. Unlike bear baiting, which was a spectacle for the masses, cockfighting often took place in smaller, more intimate settings where serious money changed hands. Men would bet everything they owned on the outcome of a single fight between two roosters. Fortunes were won and lost in the span of a few bloody minutes. The roosters were specially bred and trained for fighting. Their natural spurs were often replaced with sharp metal ones designed to do maximum damage. A good fighting cock was a prized possession, and the bloodlines of champion fighters were carefully tracked and bred. Some cocks became legendary, with their offspring selling for enormous sums. But perhaps the most bizarre public spectacle was the judicial duel, where legal disputes were settled through combat while the entire community watched. Imagine if modern court cases could be resolved by having the plaintiff and defendant beat each other with swords until one of them yielded or died. The winner was declared to be in the right, because obviously God would ensure that justice prevailed through violence. These weren't just random street fights. Judicial duels followed strict rules and elaborate ceremonies. The combatants had to swear oaths, choose their weapons according to specific regulations, and fight in designated areas blessed by priests. The entire community gathered to witness God's judgment unfold through bloodshed. Wealthy people could hire professional champions to fight for them, which created an entire economy around legal violence. If you were rich enough, you never had to risk your own life in a duel. You could just pay someone else to potentially die for your cause. Poor people, meanwhile, had to fight their own battles, literally. The crowd's role in these events went beyond passive observation. They were active participants, cheering for their favorites, placing bets, and sometimes even influencing the outcome through their reactions. If a fighter was popular with the crowd, the pressure on their opponent was immense. Losing in front of hundreds of hostile spectators was almost worse than dying. Women's participation in these spectacles was complicated. They were usually spectators rather than participants, but they were enthusiastic spectators. Medieval women cheered just as loudly for executions and animal baiting as men did. Some women even organized betting pools for cockfights or bear baiting events. The church's relationship with these entertainments was equally complex. Officially, the church condemned most blood sports and excessive violence, but practically, many priests attended these events alongside their parishioners. Some church festivals even incorporated animal baiting or other violent spectacles as part of the celebration. What's most striking about medieval public spectacles is how they brought the entire community together around shared violence. Rich and poor, young and old, men and women, all gathered in the same space to watch the same brutal entertainment. In a society divided by rigid class distinctions, blood sport was the great equalizer. These events served as pressure valves for social tension. Instead of directing their frustrations toward the nobility or the church, common people could release their aggression by watching bears maul dogs or cheering for public executions. The authorities understood this perfectly, which is why they often sponsored or encouraged these spectacles. But the entertainment value went beyond just watching violence. These events were social occasions where people caught up on gossip, conducted business, and reinforced community bonds. A bear baiting wasn't just about the bear and the dogs. It was about seeing your neighbors, hearing the latest news, and feeling part of something larger than yourself. The scheduling of these spectacles reveals how central they were to medieval life. Executions were often timed to coincide with market days to ensure maximum attendance. Animal baiting events were scheduled around religious festivals and seasonal celebrations. The entertainment calendar was carefully planned to keep people engaged and distracted throughout the year. Modern people often ask how medieval communities could be so casual about violence and death. But for people living in a world where death was a daily reality, where wars were constant, and where even childbirth carried a high risk of mortality, public spectacles simply reflected the world they knew. Violence wasn't hidden away in hospitals or on battlefields far from home. It was right there in the town square, transformed into entertainment for everyone to share. The legacy of these medieval spectacles lasted far longer than the Middle Ages themselves. Public executions continued well into the modern era, and animal baiting sports evolved into forms that persist today. The fundamental human fascination with danger, competition, and the possibility of death never really disappeared. It just got channeled into different forms of entertainment. So the next time you're watching a boxing match, a car race, or even a reality TV show where people face elimination, remember that you're participating in a tradition that goes back centuries. The medieval crowd cheering for their favorite bear wasn't so different from a modern crowd cheering for their favorite team. We've just gotten better at pretending our entertainment isn't fundamentally about watching people and animals compete, suffer, and sometimes fail spectacularly in front of an audience hungry for drama. If you think modern religious services are boring, you clearly haven't heard about medieval church festivals. These weren't quiet, contemplative affairs with soft organ music and polite hymn singing. Medieval religious entertainment was loud, chaotic, and often completely insane. The church, which spent most of the year telling people to behave themselves, would suddenly declare special days when all the rules went out the window. The most notorious of these was the Feast of Fools, an annual celebration that turned the entire social order upside down. Imagine walking into your local church on a Sunday morning and finding the altar decorated with garbage, a donkey wearing a bishop's hat, and the congregation singing drinking songs instead of hymns. That was just a typical Tuesday during the Feast of Fools. This festival usually took place around the New Year, and it was essentially medieval society's pressure release valve. For one glorious day, or sometimes an entire week, servants could mock their masters, peasants could ridicule nobles, and even the church hierarchy itself became fair game for comedy. The lowliest altar boy could be elected Pope of Fools and spend the day ordering around actual priests. The transformation was complete and deliberate. Churches that normally echoed with solemn Latin prayers would suddenly ring with bawdy songs and raucous laughter. priests would celebrate Mass wearing their vestments inside out or backwards. Instead of holy water, they might sprinkle the congregation with wine or even urine. The sacred became profane, and everyone thought it was hilarious. But the real star of the Feast of Fools was often a literal donkey. Yes, an actual donkey would be brought into the church, dressed in religious robes and treated as an honored guest. This wasn't just random animal worship. It was a deliberate parody of religious authority. The donkey would be placed at the altar while the congregation sang the prose of the ass, a mock-religious song that included verses like "Amen, Amen, say Amen, beautiful Sir Donkey, now sing." The donkey masses were so popular that different regions developed their own variations. Some churches had donkey processions through the streets before bringing the animal inside. Others crowned the donkey as a mock bishop and had it bless the congregation by braying. The louder and more obnoxious the donkey, the better the show. What's remarkable is that this wasn't underground rebellion against church authority. The church itself organized and participated in these festivals. Priests wrote the satirical songs, planned the ridiculous ceremonies, and often competed to see who could come up with the most outrageous parody of sacred rituals. It was officially sanctioned chaos. The Feast of Fools served several purposes beyond just entertainment. It allowed people to express frustrations with authority in a controlled setting. Instead of genuine rebellion, they got carnival rebellion. The church got to look like it had a sense of humor while actually reinforcing its power. After all, the very fact that breaking the rules was special made it clear that the rules existed the rest of the time. Different regions celebrated the feast differently, but they all shared certain common elements. Role reversal was always central. The highest became lowest, the serious became silly, and the sacred became ridiculous. Young priests would elect a boy bishop who would perform mock services. Choir boys would sing irreverent songs. Even nuns got into the act, though their celebrations were usually more modest. The festival often spilled out of the churches and into the streets. Processions of mock clergy would parade through towns, stopping at taverns and houses to demand food and drink. Since they were technically representing the church, even if in parody, people felt obligated to feed them. It was like Halloween, Christmas, and Mardi Gras all rolled into one chaotic celebration. But the Feast of Fools wasn't the only time religion got wild. Mystery plays, which were supposed to teach religious stories to illiterate congregations, often turned into comedy shows that had little resemblance to their sacred source material. These dramatic performances began as serious attempts to educate people about Bible stories, but they quickly evolved into entertainment spectacles that prioritized laughs over lessons. The mystery plays were performed by guilds, local trade organizations that took pride in their theatrical productions. Each guild would be assigned a different biblical story to perform. The Carpenters' Guild might perform the story of Noah's Ark, while the Bakers' Guild took on the Last Supper. This seemed logical until you realized that most guild members had no acting experience and often decided to improve on the original stories. The devil characters in mystery plays became particular crowd favorites. While angels and saints delivered their lines with wooden seriousness, the actors playing demons threw themselves into their roles with enthusiasm. They developed elaborate costumes with horns, tails, and masks. They invented crude jokes and physical comedy routines. They interacted with the audience, sometimes dragging spectators into the performance. These devil performers became so popular that people would attend mystery plays specifically to see their antics. The religious message often got lost in the entertainment value. Children would laugh and cheer when the devils appeared, which probably wasn't the intended spiritual response. The plays themselves grew increasingly elaborate and less religious over time. What started as simple reenactments of Bible stories evolved into complex productions with multiple acts, original songs, and theatrical effects. Some mystery plays took days to perform in their entirety, with different scenes staged throughout a town. Audience participation was not just encouraged, but expected. Spectators would boo the villains, cheer for the heroes, and sometimes offer suggestions to the performers. If an actor forgot his lines, someone in the crowd might shout out the correct words. If a prop broke, audience members would volunteer replacements from their own belongings. The line between performer and spectator often disappeared entirely. In some plays, audience members would be randomly selected to play angels or demons. Children would be pulled from the crowd to represent the innocent souls being fought over by good and evil. Adults would find themselves suddenly wearing costumes and delivering lines they'd never rehearsed. Some mystery plays developed running jokes that persisted for years. Certain characters would be expected to perform the same comedic routines every time the play was performed. Local personalities would be gently mocked through character portrayals. Inside jokes would develop that only regular attendees understood. The most ambitious mystery play cycles could take weeks to complete. The York Mystery Plays, for example, included 48 separate episodes covering everything from the creation to the Last Judgment. These weren't performed all at once, but spread throughout the year during various festivals and holy days. But the church's relationship with popular entertainment grew even more complicated during seasonal festivals that mixed Christian and pagan traditions. May Day celebrations, for instance, were supposed to honor the Virgin Mary, but often looked more like fertility rituals than religious observances. The May Day traditions included dancing around maypoles, crowning May queens, and gathering flowers and greenery to decorate homes and churches. These customs had obvious pagan origins related to celebrating spring fertility and new growth. The church tried to Christianize them by associating them with Mary, but the underlying earthy themes were hard to disguise. Young people would go into the woods before dawn on May 1st to gather flowers and branches. What exactly they did in those woods became the subject of considerable gossip and concern. Church leaders worried that May Day was becoming an excuse for unmarried couples to spend unsupervised time together in romantic settings. The maypole itself was clearly a phallic symbol, though nobody talked about it in those terms. The tall wooden pole decorated with ribbons and flowers, around which young people danced in interweaving patterns, had fertility symbolism that wasn't lost on medieval observers, even if they didn't discuss it openly. May Day celebrations often included the selection of a May Queen and sometimes a May King who would preside over the festivities. These temporary monarchs were usually young, attractive, and unmarried. Their reign lasted only for the day, but it included considerable ceremony and celebration. The May Queen would be crowned with flowers, dressed in the finest clothes the community could provide, and treated like royalty. The May King and Queen were supposed to represent the renewal of life and the promise of future fertility. Their symbolic marriage was sometimes part of the celebration, though whether these ceremonies ever became actual marriages is unclear. What is clear is that the church was never entirely comfortable with the sexual undertones of these spring celebrations. Midsummer festivals presented similar challenges for church authorities. The summer solstice had been celebrated long before Christianity arrived in Europe, and those ancient traditions proved remarkably resistant to Christian modification. Midsummer celebrations centered around bonfires, which were supposed to protect communities from evil spirits and ensure good harvests. The bonfires themselves became major community projects. People would gather fuel for weeks in advance, competing to build the largest and most impressive fire. The lighting of the midsummer bonfire was a ceremonial moment that brought entire villages together. Young people would jump over smaller fires for luck and courage. Couples would hold hands and leap together over flames as a form of betrothal ritual. Herbs and flowers collected on Midsummer's Eve were believed to have special magical properties. People would gather specific plants and hang them in their homes for protection against illness and bad luck. Some of these herbs would be thrown into the bonfires as offerings, while others would be kept throughout the year as charms and remedies. The church tried to Christianize midsummer celebrations by associating them with the feast day of John the Baptist, whose birth was celebrated on June 24th. The fires became symbols of John's role as the forerunner to Christ, the light that prepared the way for the greater light to come. But the pagan elements remained strong beneath the Christian veneer. Harvest festivals presented the church with similar opportunities and challenges. These celebrations marked the end of the agricultural year and the community's survival for another winter. They were times of genuine thanksgiving, which made them relatively easy to incorporate into Christian observance. But they were also times of great revelry as people celebrated their success and tried to forget the hard winter months ahead. Harvest festivals included communal feasting on a scale that most modern people have never experienced. Entire communities would pool their resources to create massive meals that lasted for days. Everyone contributed something, whether it was grain, meat, vegetables, ale, or labor. The resulting celebrations were exercises in organized excess. The feasting was accompanied by dancing, singing, games, and general merrymaking that often went on until dawn. These weren't polite dinner parties with careful conversation and modest portions. They were raucous celebrations where people ate until they were sick, drank until they passed out, and danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. What made these religious festivals particularly wild was that they combined the authority of the church with the enthusiasm of popular culture. People felt they had official permission to behave badly, which removed many of the normal social restraints. If the priest said it was okay to mock authority during the Feast of Fools, then mocking authority became a religious duty. The church's participation in these festivals also created a strange kind of spiritual democracy. During most of the year, religious services reinforced social hierarchies and emphasized obedience to authority. But during festival times, those same authorities participated in their own humiliation and encouraged everyone else to join in. These festivals revealed something important about medieval Christianity. It wasn't the grim, repressive force that many modern people imagine. Medieval Christianity was surprisingly flexible and accommodating to human nature. Church leaders understood that people needed outlets for their frustrations, desires, and sense of humor. Rather than trying to suppress these needs entirely, they channeled them into controlled celebrations that ultimately reinforced rather than undermined church authority. The legacy of these wild religious festivals can still be seen today in celebrations like Mardi Gras, which preserves the medieval tradition of sanctioned misbehavior before a period of religious restraint. The idea that religious communities need times of celebration and release remains part of many Christian traditions, even if modern versions are considerably more subdued than their medieval predecessors. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people were grimly serious about their religion, remind them about the donkey masses, the devil comedians, and the priests who celebrated holy days by wearing their vestments backwards and singing drinking songs. Medieval religious entertainment proved that faith and fun weren't mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the best way to honor God was to have a really good laugh. If you think gambling addiction is a modern problem, you've clearly never heard about medieval dice games. These weren't casual pastimes or friendly wagers between neighbors. Medieval gambling was a serious business that could destroy lives, break up families, and sometimes end in murder. The church condemned it, the authorities tried to ban it, and people did it anyway with a passion that would make modern casino operators jealous. Dice were everywhere in medieval society. Rich merchants carried ivory dice in silk pouches. Poor peasants carved their own dice from bone or wood. Soldiers gambled away their pay before they'd even earned it. Monks snuck dice into monasteries despite vows of poverty. Even children played dice games, though usually with beans or stones instead of money. The games themselves were surprisingly sophisticated. While modern people might think medieval dice games were simple affairs, they actually involved complex betting systems, multiple rounds of play, and intricate rules that varied from region to region. The most popular game was called Hazard, which was the ancestor of modern craps and just as addictive. Hazard could be played with as few as 2 people or as many as could crowd around a table. Players would take turns being the caster who threw the dice, while others bet on the outcome. The rules were complicated enough that disputes were common, and these disputes often led to violence. Tavern fights over dice games were so frequent that many establishments banned gambling entirely, though enforcement was nearly impossible. What made medieval gambling particularly dangerous was the complete lack of regulation or consumer protection. Loaded dice were common, and skilled cheaters could make a very good living by traveling from town to town and fleeing before their victims realized they'd been swindled. Some dice were weighted with lead, others had certain numbers repeated on multiple faces, and the most sophisticated were hollow and filled with mercury that would settle differently depending on how they were thrown. The techniques for cheating were passed down through generations of professional gamblers like family trades. A skilled dice mechanic could control the outcome of throws through subtle manipulation of the dice, special throwing techniques, or even sleight of hand that substituted loaded dice for legitimate ones during play. The really good cheaters could work their magic right under the noses of suspicious opponents. But detecting cheating was almost as much an art as performing it. Experienced gamblers developed their own tests for loaded dice, including floating them in water to check their balance, examining them under candlelight for signs of tampering, and even biting them to test their density. Some taverns kept their own sets of dice that they guaranteed were honest, though even these could be compromised by clever cheaters. The social consequences of gambling addiction were severe in a world where most people lived very close to the poverty line. A bad night at dice could mean a family went hungry for weeks. A really bad night could mean losing your house, your tools, or even your children, who could be sold into servitude to pay gambling debts. Medieval records are full of stories about people who gambled away everything they owned in single sessions. One chronicle tells of a merchant who lost his entire stock of cloth in a dice game and then bet his wife's jewelry, his children's inheritance, and finally, his own clothes. He walked home naked and penniless, facing a family who would spend the winter in poverty because of his gambling addiction. The church's response to gambling was complicated and often hypocritical. Officially, the church condemned gambling as a sin that led to greed, violence, and the neglect of family responsibilities. Priests regularly preached against dice games and other forms of gambling. But unofficially, many religious institutions used gambling to raise funds for construction projects, charity work, and other church activities. Some churches organized lotteries where people could buy chances to win religious relics, blessed objects, or even indulgences that would reduce their time in purgatory. These religious lotteries were technically gambling, but they were justified as forms of charitable giving that happened to include an element of chance. The distinction was often lost on participants, who approached church lotteries with the same enthusiasm they brought to tavern dice games. Secular authorities had their own complicated relationship with gambling. Kings and nobles often banned gambling among their subjects, while maintaining elaborate gambling establishments in their own courts. The official reason was that gambling distracted common people from their work and military duties. But the real reason was often that the authorities wanted to control who had access to large amounts of cash. Some rulers tried to regulate gambling rather than ban it entirely. They would license certain establishments to operate games of chance, collect taxes on gambling revenue, and prosecute unlicensed gambling operations. This created a medieval version of the modern casino industry, complete with official gaming licenses and government oversight. But enforcement was nearly impossible in a world where most transactions were conducted in cash and record-keeping was minimal. Unlicensed gambling operations could spring up anywhere people gathered. Market days, festivals, and even church services became opportunities for impromptu gambling sessions. As long as someone had dice and others had money, a game could start. The most serious gambling took place during medieval tournaments and other sporting events. These weren't just casual wagers on the outcome of contests. They were elaborate betting markets where people could wager on everything from which knight would win a joust to which horse would finish first in a race. The amounts of money involved were enormous, sometimes representing years of income for ordinary people. Tournament gambling created its own economy of professional bettors, odds makers, and information brokers. People who made their living from gambling would travel from tournament to tournament, studying the competitors, gathering inside information, and placing carefully calculated bets. Some of these professional gamblers became quite wealthy, though they also faced the constant risk of losing everything on a single bad bet. The gambling around tournaments was so intense that it sometimes overshadowed the actual competitions. Spectators would pay more attention to their bets than to the athletic performances. Knights complained that the crowd was more interested in the gambling than in the skill and courage being displayed in the arena. Medieval football, which was more like organized warfare than modern soccer, became another major gambling opportunity. These games involved entire villages competing against each other in matches that could last for hours and cover miles of countryside. The lack of clear rules and the chaotic nature of the games made them perfect for gambling, since almost anything could happen. Football gambling was often organized by the same people who ran other illegal activities in medieval communities. Betting on football games was frequently connected to other forms of underground commerce, including prostitution, black market trading, and even organized crime. The gambling operations around major football matches could involve hundreds of people and enormous sums of money. But gambling wasn't limited to dice and sports. Medieval people would bet on almost anything that involved uncertainty. They wagered on the weather, the outcome of legal disputes, the gender of unborn children, and even the date of their own deaths. Some of these bets were made in jest, but others involved serious money and legal contracts. One particularly popular form of gambling involved predicting the outcomes of trials by combat. Since these legal proceedings were supposed to be decided by divine intervention, betting on them was technically betting on God's will. This created interesting theological questions about whether such gambling was sinful, since it involved predicting divine judgment. The development of playing cards in the later medieval period created new opportunities for gambling and new forms of addiction. Card games were more portable than dice games, required less equipment, and could be played more quietly. This made them popular in settings where gambling was officially prohibited, but practically tolerated. Early playing cards were hand-painted and quite expensive, which meant that card gambling was initially limited to the wealthy. But as printing techniques improved and cards became cheaper, card gambling spread throughout medieval society. By the end of the medieval period, card games had become as popular as dice games for serious gambling. The psychological appeal of medieval gambling was similar to its modern counterpart. People were drawn to the possibility of sudden wealth, the excitement of risk, and the social aspects of gaming. But medieval gambling also served some unique functions in a society where most people had very limited opportunities for social mobility. For many medieval people, gambling represented one of the few ways they could potentially change their economic circumstances dramatically and quickly. A successful night of gambling could provide money for better tools, livestock, or even land. The remote possibility of a big win was worth the risk for people who saw no other path to prosperity. Gambling also served as a form of informal insurance in medieval communities. People who won big were expected to share their good fortune with friends and family who had supported them during losing streaks. This created networks of mutual support that could help people survive economic emergencies, though it also created cycles of dependency and obligation that could be difficult to escape. The social aspects of gambling were particularly important in medieval society. Gambling sessions brought people together across class lines in ways that few other activities could. A dice game might include nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and peasants all participating as equals. The shared excitement of gambling created temporary communities where normal social hierarchies were suspended. But these gambling communities could also be exclusive and intimidating. Professional gamblers developed their own slang, customs, and codes of behavior that outsiders found difficult to understand. Being accepted into serious gambling circles required not just money, but also knowledge of the games, respect for the unwritten rules, and the ability to lose gracefully when luck turned bad. The violence associated with medieval gambling was legendary. Accusations of cheating, disputes over rules, and arguments about payouts regularly led to fights that could involve knives, swords, or any other weapons that happened to be available. Some gambling establishments employed armed guards specifically to break up fights and maintain order. The most serious gambling violence occurred when people lost more than they could afford to pay. Medieval society had no bankruptcy laws or consumer protections, so gambling debts were collected through whatever means necessary. This could include seizing property, demanding labor services, or even taking family members as hostages until debts were paid. Some gambling debts were never paid, leading to long-standing feuds between families and communities. A gambling dispute could escalate into a cycle of revenge that lasted for generations. Medieval chronicles contain numerous stories of murders, raids, and even small wars that began as arguments over dice games. Despite all the dangers and social problems associated with gambling, medieval authorities never succeeded in eliminating it. Every attempt at prohibition simply drove gambling underground, where it became more dangerous and more closely connected to other criminal activities. The demand for gambling was too strong and the opportunities too numerous for any government to control effectively. The legacy of medieval gambling culture can be seen in modern attitudes toward games of chance. The combination of official disapproval and popular enthusiasm that characterized medieval gambling still exists today. The techniques for cheating that were developed by medieval gamblers laid the foundation for modern gambling security measures. Even the games themselves evolved directly from medieval predecessors. So the next time you buy a lottery ticket, place a bet on a sporting event, or even play a casual card game with friends, remember that you're participating in a tradition that goes back centuries. The medieval peasant throwing dice in a tavern and the modern person playing poker online are connected by the same basic human desires for excitement, social connection, and the possibility that luck might change everything in an instant. You're walking through a medieval village at dusk when you hear the sound of drums and pipes coming from the forest. Your first instinct might be to investigate, but if you were a medieval person, you'd probably cross yourself and hurry home. That music might be harmless entertainment, or it might be something much more dangerous. In the medieval world, the wrong song at the wrong time could get you accused of witchcraft, heresy, or treason. Music and dance weren't just entertainment in medieval society. They were powerful forces that could unite communities, challenge authority, or supposedly summon supernatural beings. The church understood this power perfectly, which is why they tried so hard to control what people sang when they danced and which instruments they played. Let's start with the traveling minstrels, who were essentially the medieval equivalent of rock stars, journalists, and potentially dangerous subversives all rolled into one. These wandering musicians moved from town to town, castle to castle, carrying news, gossip, and entertainment wherever they went. They were welcomed everywhere and trusted nowhere. A good minstrel could make or break reputations with their songs. They carried stories of distant lands, news of political events, and most dangerously of all, satirical songs about local nobles and church officials. A minstrel who composed a clever song mocking an unpopular lord could become a folk hero overnight. The same minstrel could also find himself fleeing for his life if the lord had a sense of humor shortage. The best minstrels were walking libraries of human knowledge. They memorized hundreds of songs, stories, and poems. They knew the genealogies of noble families, the histories of kingdoms, and the scandals of courts across Europe. This made them valuable sources of information, but also potential security risks. A minstrel who knew too much about the wrong people could become a target for assassination or imprisonment. Female minstrels faced additional challenges and opportunities. They were often suspected of being prostitutes, spies, or witches, sometimes all three at once. But they also had access to private spaces and intimate conversations that male minstrels couldn't reach. A female minstrel who could sing beautifully and gather intelligence discreetly could make a very good living, though she also faced constant danger. The instruments that minstrels played were themselves sources of suspicion and fascination. The church had strong opinions about which instruments were appropriate for Christian use and which ones were tools of the devil. The organ was holy because it was played in churches. Harps were acceptable because they were associated with King David and the biblical Psalms. But drums, pipes, and especially bagpipes were considered potentially demonic. Bagpipes were particularly problematic from the church's perspective. They made loud, penetrating sounds that could be heard for miles. They were associated with Scottish and Irish cultures that the English church considered pagan. Most suspiciously of all, They were made from animal skins and produced sounds by inflating dead animals with human breath. To medieval minds, this seemed uncomfortably close to the necromancy and demon summoning. The fiddle, which evolved into the modern violin, was another instrument that made church authorities nervous. Fiddles were portable, relatively easy to learn, and produced music that made people want to dance. The association between fiddle music and uncontrolled physical movement worried religious leaders who preferred music that encouraged contemplation and prayer rather than bodily expression. But the real trouble started when people began dancing to these forbidden instruments. Dancing itself wasn't necessarily problematic. The church had its own approved dances for religious festivals and ceremonies. The problem was when people danced to non-Christian music, in non-Christian ways, at non-Christian times and places. Circle dancing was particularly suspicious because it resembled pagan rituals and witch gatherings. When people joined hands and danced in circles, especially at night or in remote locations, authorities assumed they were participating in something supernatural. The fact that circle dances often included chanting or singing in regional dialects rather than Latin made them even more suspect. The dancing plagues of medieval Europe remain one of history's most bizarre and unexplained phenomena. In multiple instances, hundreds of people would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably and continue for days or even weeks until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from the experience. The dancing was described as frenzied, involuntary, and apparently contagious. The most famous dancing plague occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in the street for no apparent reason. Within days, dozens of others had joined her. Within a month, hundreds of people were dancing continuously. The local authorities actually hired professional musicians to play for the dancers, thinking that organized music might help cure them. It didn't work. Modern historians and medical experts have proposed various explanations for the dancing plagues. Some suggest mass hysteria triggered by social stress. Others point to ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, which could cause hallucinations and involuntary muscle spasms. Still others believe the dancing was a form of religious ecstasy or cultural expression that got out of control. But to medieval observers, the dancing plagues were clearly supernatural in origin. The only question was whether they were caused by divine judgment, demonic possession, or witchcraft. In many cases, the authorities blamed individuals who were already suspected of magical activities. If someone had been teaching new dances or playing unusual music before a dancing plague began, they became prime suspects for causing the outbreak. Folk dancing served important social functions beyond just entertainment. Community dances brought people together across class lines and strengthened social bonds. Seasonal dances marked important transitions in the agricultural calendar and helped communities coordinate their activities. Courtship dances provided supervised opportunities for young people to interact and choose potential marriage partners. But these same social functions made dancing politically significant. When people gathered to dance, they also had opportunities to share information, make plans, and potentially organize resistance to authority. A seemingly innocent dance gathering could become a meeting place for political dissidents or religious heretics. The church's response to folk dancing was characteristically complex and contradictory. Official church doctrine condemned most secular dancing as a distraction from spiritual concerns and a potential source of moral corruption. But many priests and religious communities participated in folk dances, especially during major festivals and celebrations. Some regions developed elaborate religious dances that were officially approved by church authorities. These dances told biblical stories, honored saints, or celebrated religious holidays. But even religious dances could become controversial if they were too enthusiastic, or if they included elements borrowed from pagan traditions. The music that accompanied medieval dancing was often passed down through oral tradition rather than written notation. This meant that songs could evolve and change over time, picking up new verses, melodies, or meanings as they traveled from community to community. A song that started as innocent entertainment in one village might acquire subversive political messages by the time it reached another region. Drinking songs were a particularly important category of medieval music. These weren't just tavern entertainment. They were social glue that bonded communities together and provided outlets for expressing frustrations that couldn't be voiced in more formal settings. A good drinking song could unite people from different social classes in shared criticism of authority figures. The lyrics of drinking songs often included coded references to political events, social problems, or religious controversies. Singers could express dangerous opinions by claiming they were just repeating traditional verses rather than making original political statements. This gave drinking songs a subversive potential that authorities found threatening. Work songs served similar functions in agricultural and craft communities. These songs helped coordinate group labor, made repetitive tasks more bearable, and provided opportunities for social commentary. Harvest songs, spinning songs, and craft guild songs all included verses that commented on working conditions, economic problems, and social relationships. The rhythm of work songs was particularly important because it helped groups of people coordinate their physical movements. When people worked together to the same rhythm, they could accomplish tasks more efficiently and safely. But this same rhythmic coordination could be used for other purposes, including military drilling or organized protests. Seasonal songs marked the passage of time and helped communities prepare for changes in weather, agricultural activities, and social expectations. Spring songs celebrated renewal and fertility. Harvest songs gave thanks for successful crops and prepared people for winter hardships. Winter songs provided comfort during the darkest months and looked forward to the return of spring. But seasonal songs also preserved ancient traditions and beliefs that predated Christianity. Many spring songs included references to fertility rituals, nature spirits, and pagan deities. Harvest songs often included elements of sympathetic magic designed to ensure continued prosperity. Winter songs sometimes invoked protective spirits or offered sacrifices to supernatural forces. The church tried to Christianize seasonal songs by replacing pagan references with biblical themes and Christian imagery. Spring songs became celebrations of Christ's resurrection. Harvest songs became expressions of gratitude to God for his providence. Winter songs became meditations on spiritual darkness and the promise of divine light. But the underlying pagan elements proved remarkably resistant to Christian modification. People continued to sing about nature spirits even when the official lyrics referred to angels. They performed fertility rituals even when the ceremonies were officially dedicated to Christian saints. The old traditions survived beneath the new religious veneer. Children's songs and games formed another important category of medieval music. These weren't just innocent entertainment. They were educational tools that taught children about social roles, cultural values, and survival skills. Nursery rhymes often contained coded information about historical events, political controversies, or social problems. Many children's songs included elements of traditional folklore that adults might hesitate to express directly. Stories about witches, giants, and magical creatures could be dismissed as children's entertainment, even when they contained serious social commentary or preserved ancient cultural memories. The playground games that accompanied children's songs often mimicked adult activities and responsibilities. Children played at being merchants, soldiers, priests, and nobles. These games taught them about social hierarchies and prepared them for their future roles in medieval society. But children's songs and games also provided opportunities for social criticism and boundary testing. Children could mock adult authority figures through song and play in ways that would be dangerous for adults to attempt. The apparent innocence of children's entertainment provided cover for expressing ideas that might otherwise be considered subversive. The transmission of musical knowledge in medieval society depended heavily on memory and oral tradition. Most people couldn't read musical notation, so they learned songs by listening and repetition. This meant that musical knowledge was concentrated among people who had good memories and opportunities to hear many different songs. Professional musicians developed remarkable abilities to memorize and perform hundreds of different pieces. They could adapt their performances to different audiences, occasions, and social settings. A skilled minstrel could perform the same basic song as a courtly romance for nobles, a moral tale for church audiences, or a bawdy comedy for tavern crowds. The lack of written musical notation also meant that songs could evolve rapidly as they passed from performer to performer. Each musician might add their own variations, interpretations, or improvements. Over time, a single original song could spawn dozens of regional variants with different melodies, lyrics, or meanings. This musical evolution sometimes created problems when songs with similar melodies carried very different messages. A tune that was associated with religious devotion in one region might be connected to political rebellion in another. Singing the wrong version of a familiar melody could send unintended signals about the performer's beliefs or loyalties. The economic aspects of medieval music were surprisingly complex. Professional musicians could make good livings if they were skilled and lucky, but they also faced constant uncertainty and potential danger. A musician who pleased one audience might offend another. Success in one location didn't guarantee acceptance elsewhere. Many musicians supplemented their musical income with other activities. They might work as messengers, carrying news and letters between communities. They could serve as informal diplomats, helping to negotiate disputes or arrange marriages between families. Some musicians worked as spies, gathering intelligence while appearing to provide harmless entertainment. The most successful musicians often attached themselves to wealthy patrons who could provide steady income and protection. Court musicians enjoyed security and prestige, but they also faced restrictions on their repertoires and potential punishment if they displeased their employers. A court musician who sang the wrong song at the wrong time could find themselves exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The relationship between music and political power was particularly complex during times of war and social upheaval. Military commanders understood that the right songs could inspire their troops and demoralize their enemies. Rebel leaders used music to spread their messages and rally supporters. Governments tried to control musical performances that might encourage dissent or resistance. Battle songs served multiple functions in medieval warfare. They helped soldiers coordinate their movements, maintained morale during difficult campaigns, and celebrated victories over enemies. But battle songs also preserved military traditions, honored fallen comrades, and sometimes criticized military leadership or questioned the justice of particular wars. The aftermath of battles often produced new songs that commemorated the events and shaped how they would be remembered by future generations. These songs could present very different interpretations of the same events, depending on who wrote them and for what audience. A victory song for the winning side might become a lament for the losers. The power of music to shape memory and influence opinion made it a valuable tool for political propaganda. Rulers sponsored musicians to compose songs celebrating their achievements and justifying their policies. These official songs were performed at court ceremonies, public festivals, and other events where they could reach large audiences. But unofficial songs often carried more emotional weight than official propaganda. Folk songs that arose spontaneously from popular sentiment could spread rapidly through communities and persist for generations. A song that captured the public mood could become more influential than formal political speeches or written proclamations. The intersection of music, politics, and religion created particularly complex situations during the medieval period. Songs that were acceptable in secular contexts might be problematic in religious settings. Music that was appropriate for one Christian denomination might be heretical for another. The same melody might be considered sacred or profane, depending on its lyrics and context. So the next time you hear music that makes you want to dance, or find yourself humming along to a song without thinking about the words, remember that you're experiencing something that medieval people considered potentially dangerous. The power of music to move people, literally and figuratively, hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at pretending that entertainment is harmless, when in fact it has always been one of the most powerful forces for social change, resistance, and human connection. If you think modern celebrities live extravagant lives, you should meet a medieval court jester. These weren't just silly people in colorful outfits telling knock-knock jokes. Court jesters were some of the most intelligent, politically savvy, and dangerous people in medieval society. They had a license to say things that would get anyone else executed, and they used that license to wield influence that modern comedians could only dream of. The role of the court fool was one of the most paradoxical positions in medieval society. Officially, they were the lowest members of the court hierarchy, treated as amusing pets rather than serious people. Unofficially, they often had more access to the king than his most trusted advisors, and could influence royal decisions through carefully crafted jokes and seemingly innocent observations. A good court jester needed to be part comedian, part psychologist, part political analyst, and part acrobat. They had to be entertaining enough to keep their audiences laughing, intelligent enough to understand complex political situations, and brave enough to risk their lives by mocking powerful people. Most importantly, they needed perfect timing. The same joke that earned applause on one day could earn a death sentence on another. The most successful jesters developed their own unique personas and performance styles. Some specialized in physical comedy, juggling, and acrobatics. Others focused on wordplay, riddles, and verbal wit. The best combined multiple skills into performances that could last for hours and leave audiences both entertained and subtly educated about current events. Female entertainers at medieval courts faced even more complex challenges than their male counterparts. They were often suspected of being spies, prostitutes, or witches, sometimes accurately, but they also had opportunities that other women in medieval society couldn't access. A talented female entertainer could travel freely, accumulate wealth, and influence powerful men in ways that were impossible for conventional medieval women. Some female court entertainers became unofficial advisors to queens and noble ladies. They could provide information about political developments, carry messages between different courts, and sometimes negotiate marriages or alliances through their connections. Their apparent frivolity provided perfect cover for serious diplomatic activities. The economics of court entertainment were surprisingly complex. Successful entertainers could become quite wealthy, but they also faced constant financial uncertainty. A jester who fell out of favor could find themselves penniless overnight. Smart entertainers saved money during good times and maintained connections with multiple patrons to protect themselves against sudden changes in fortune. The most expensive court entertainers were those who could provide exclusive content. A jester who created original material specifically for one court was more valuable than one who recycled the same jokes everywhere. The best entertainers developed signature routines that became associated with particular courts and couldn't be seen anywhere else. But the real spectacle of medieval court entertainment was the elaborate feast, which was less about food and more about displaying wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. These weren't just meals. They were theatrical productions that could last for hours and cost more than most people earned in years. A major court feast required months of planning and preparation. Cooks, servants, entertainers, and craftsmen would work together to create experiences that guests would remember for the rest of their lives. The goal wasn't just to feed people. It was to overwhelm them with luxury and demonstrate the host's superiority over their rivals. The food at these feasts was often secondary to the presentation. Dishes were designed to impress rather than nourish. Cooks created elaborate sculptures from sugar and marzipan. They roasted entire animals and presented them as if they were still alive. They prepared dishes that were deliberately exotic and expensive, using spices that cost more than gold and ingredients that had to be imported from distant lands. Between the courses, which could number in the dozens, guests were entertained by a rotating cast of performers. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians, dancers, and storytellers would present carefully choreographed shows designed to complement the meal and reinforce the host's political messages. Even the entertainment was a form of propaganda. The seating arrangements at court feasts were complex political statements in themselves. Where you sat, what you were served, and who you were seated next to all communicated your status, your relationship with the host, and your position in the broader political landscape. Getting the seating wrong could cause diplomatic incidents or personal feuds that lasted for generations. The most elaborate feasts included live animals as entertainment. Bears, leopards, exotic birds, and other creatures would be brought into the dining hall to amaze the guests. Sometimes these animals were trained to perform tricks. Other times they were simply displayed as symbols of the host's wealth and power. The more dangerous and exotic the animal, the greater the impression it made. Some feasts featured entertainment that would horrify modern audiences. Mock battles between dwarfs, fights between animals, and even executions were sometimes included as dinner entertainment. The line between celebration and cruelty was often non-existent in medieval court culture. The tournaments that provided entertainment for medieval courts were equally elaborate and dangerous affairs. These weren't just sporting events. They were military exercises, social gatherings, economic investments, and political theater all combined into spectacular shows that could attract participants and spectators from across Europe. Preparing for a major tournament required enormous financial investment. Knights had to purchase or rent expensive armor, weapons, and horses. They needed to hire squires, grooms, and other support staff. The costs could easily bankrupt noble families, but the potential rewards in terms of prize money, social status, and political connections made the investment worthwhile for many participants. The tournaments themselves were incredibly dangerous. Despite rules designed to minimize fatalities, knights regularly died in tournament combat. Horses were killed even more frequently. The medical facilities at tournaments were primitive, and serious injuries often resulted in permanent disability or death from infection. But the danger was part of the appeal for both participants and spectators. Tournaments provided opportunities to demonstrate courage, skill, and honor in ways that were increasingly rare in medieval society. For knights who lived during periods of relative peace, tournaments offered the only chances to prove themselves in combat and gain the respect of their peers. The economic impact of major tournaments was enormous. Host communities could see their populations double or triple during tournament weeks. Merchants, craftsmen, entertainers, and service providers all benefited from the influx of wealthy visitors. Some communities built their entire economies around hosting regular tournaments. The social aspects of tournaments were as important as the combat itself. These events brought together nobles from different regions and countries, providing opportunities for networking, matchmaking, and political negotiation. Many marriages, alliances, and business deals were arranged during tournament festivities. Female participation in tournament culture was complex and controversial. Women were usually spectators rather than participants, but they played crucial roles in the social dynamics of tournament events. The concept of courtly love, where knights dedicated their performances to particular ladies, gave women unofficial influence over tournament outcomes. Some women became tournament celebrities in their own right. Queens and noble ladies who were known for their beauty, intelligence, or political influence could attract knights from across Europe who competed for their attention and favor. The most influential women could effectively sponsor tournaments by promising their favor to particular participants. The judging of tournaments was often as politically complex as the combat itself. Tournaments were supposed to be decided by skill and courage, but factors like political alliances, personal relationships, and economic considerations often influenced the outcomes. Corrupt judging was common, and accusations of bias regularly led to conflicts that extended far beyond the tournament grounds. The prizes for tournament victories went beyond simple monetary rewards. Successful tournament participants gained social status, political connections, and opportunities for advancement that could transform their entire careers. Some knights used tournament success to secure marriages with wealthy heiresses, positions in royal courts, or military commands in important campaigns. But tournament culture also had a dark side that reflected the violent realities of medieval society. The same skills that made knights successful in tournaments made them effective in warfare. Many tournament champions became notorious for their brutality in actual military campaigns. The line between sport and preparation for real violence was never clear. The equipment and technology developed for tournaments often had military applications. Improvements in armor design, weapon construction, and horse training that were developed for tournament use quickly found their way onto actual battlefields. In some ways, tournaments served as research and development laboratories for military innovation. The international character of tournament culture helped spread military techniques, cultural practices, and political ideas across medieval Europe. Knights who participated in tournaments in different countries brought home new fighting techniques, social customs, and political concepts that influenced their own societies. Court entertainment also included more intimate forms of artistic expression that required sophisticated cultural knowledge to appreciate fully. Poetry competitions, musical performances, and storytelling contests were regular features of court life that provided entertainment, while also demonstrating the cultural sophistication of both performers and audiences. These literary entertainments were often highly competitive and sometimes quite vicious. Poets would engage in verbal duels where they tried to outdo each other with clever insults, complex wordplay, and demonstrations of classical learning. The audiences for these competitions were expected to understand subtle references to literature, history, and current events. The themes of court literature were carefully chosen to flatter the host while providing commentary on contemporary political and social issues. Love poetry, heroic tales, and religious allegories all contained coded messages about current events, political relationships, and social problems. Understanding these coded messages was part of what made someone a sophisticated member of court society. The patronage system that supported court entertainment created complex relationships between artists and their sponsors. Entertainers who accepted patronage were expected to produce work that reflected well on their patrons and advanced their political interests. But they also needed to maintain enough independence to create genuinely entertaining content that would appeal to broader audiences. The most successful court entertainers learned to balance these competing demands by developing techniques for embedding multiple layers of meaning in their work. A single poem or song could simultaneously flatter the patron, entertain the immediate audience, and convey subversive messages to those who understood the coded references. The international nature of medieval court culture meant that entertainers often had to adapt their performances for audiences from different cultural backgrounds. A jester who was hilarious in an English court might fall flat in a French one if they didn't understand the local political situation, cultural references, and social sensitivities. Language barriers created additional challenges for court entertainers who wanted to work internationally. The most successful developed repertoires that included material in multiple languages or relied heavily on physical comedy and visual spectacle that could transcend linguistic differences. The preservation of court entertainment traditions depended heavily on oral transmission and apprenticeship systems. Young entertainers learned their crafts by studying with established masters, gradually developing their own styles while maintaining connections to traditional forms and techniques. Some forms of court entertainment were preserved in written form, but most existed only in the memories and skills of individual performers. When a master entertainer died without passing on their knowledge, entire performance traditions could disappear. This made the entertainment culture of medieval courts both rich and fragile. The decline of the medieval court system eventually led to the transformation of court entertainment into new forms that served different social functions. Many techniques and traditions that were developed for medieval courts eventually influenced the development of modern theater, music, and literature. But the basic human desires for entertainment, social connection, and cultural expression that drove medieval court culture remain unchanged. The medieval court jester who risked execution to make a political point through humor has more in common with a modern political comedian than either might want to admit. So the next time you watch a comedian making jokes about politicians, attend a formal dinner with multiple courses and entertainment, or see a sporting event that combines athleticism with spectacle. Remember that you're experiencing evolved versions of entertainment forms that were perfected in medieval courts. The technology has changed, but the fundamental human need for sophisticated entertainment that combines pleasure with social and political commentary remains exactly the same. Long before Netflix, Amazon Prime, or even television existed, medieval people had their own form of binge-worthy entertainment. that could keep audiences captivated for hours or even days at a time. Professional storytellers were the original streaming service, carrying vast libraries of content in their memories and delivering personalized entertainment experiences to audiences across Europe. These weren't just people who happened to know a few good stories. Professional storytellers were walking databases of human culture, who could recite epic poems that took 12 hours to perform, adapt their material for different audiences on the fly, and create original content that would be remembered and retold for generations. They were part entertainer, part historian, part journalist, and part computer hard drive. The most skilled storytellers could memorize hundreds of different tales, poems, and songs. They knew multiple versions of popular stories and could choose the appropriate version based on their audience, the occasion, and the current political climate. A single story about King Arthur might be told as a romantic adventure for noble ladies, a military tale for knights, a moral lesson for church audiences, or a comedy for tavern crowds. The memorization techniques used by medieval storytellers were incredibly sophisticated. They developed elaborate mental filing systems that allowed them to organize and retrieve vast amounts of information quickly and accurately. Some used architectural memory techniques, imagining stories taking place in familiar buildings, and using the layout of rooms to remember the sequence of events. Others organized their repertoires around recurring themes, character types, or narrative structures that could be mixed and matched to create seemingly endless variations. A skilled storyteller might know 50 different opening formulas, 100 character types, and dozens of plot structures that could be combined in thousands of different ways. The training required to become a professional storyteller was extensive and demanding. Young apprentices would spend years learning stories, developing their memory skills, and practicing their performance techniques. They had to master not just the content of stories, but also the timing, vocal techniques, and physical gestures that made storytelling compelling. Many storytellers specialized in particular types of content. Some focused on epic poems about heroic adventures and legendary battles. Others preferred romantic tales of courtly love and noble sacrifice. Still others specialized in religious stories, moral fables, or humorous anecdotes. The most versatile storytellers could perform all these different types of content and switch between them seamlessly during a single performance. The business model of professional storytelling was surprisingly complex. Storytellers had to balance the need for popular content that would attract large audiences with the demand for exclusive material that wealthy patrons would pay premium prices to hear. The most successful storytellers developed signature stories that couldn't be heard anywhere else, while also maintaining repertoires of crowd-pleasing favorites. Some storytellers worked as freelancers, traveling from town to town and performing wherever they could find audiences willing to pay. Others attached themselves to wealthy patrons who provided steady income in exchange for exclusive access to their services. The most successful developed networks of contacts that allowed them to coordinate their travels and avoid competing directly with other storytellers. The content that storytellers carried was never just entertainment. Their stories served as news services, history lessons, moral instruction, and social commentary, all rolled into one. A story about a legendary king might contain coded references to current political events. A romantic tale could include practical advice about marriage and relationships. Even the most fantastic adventures often contained information about geography, customs, and cultures from distant lands. Storytellers were often the only source of information about events happening beyond the immediate community. They carried news of wars, political changes, natural disasters, and social developments from region to region. In a world without newspapers, radio, or television, storytellers served as the primary means of mass communication. But this information-carrying function also made storytellers potentially dangerous from the perspective of political and religious authorities. A storyteller who spread news that contradicted official accounts, or who told stories that undermined established authority, could be accused of spreading sedition or heresy. The most careful storytellers learned to embed their social commentary in fictional narratives that couldn't be directly traced to real events or people. They developed techniques for criticizing contemporary problems through stories about mythical kingdoms, legendary heroes, or ancient times. Audiences understood these coded references, but storytellers could always claim they were just repeating traditional tales rather than making original political statements. The interactive nature of medieval storytelling was very different from modern passive entertainment consumption. Audiences were expected to participate actively in storytelling sessions through applause, laughter, questions, and sometimes even contributions to the narrative. A skilled storyteller could read their audience and adjust their performance accordingly, extending popular sections, skipping boring parts, or improvising new material based on audience reactions. Some storytelling sessions became collaborative performances where audience members would contribute their own versions of familiar stories, add new details to ongoing narratives, or even challenge the storyteller's interpretation of events. These interactions could lead to lively debates about the meaning of stories, the accuracy of historical accounts, or the moral lessons to be drawn from particular tales. The social dynamics of storytelling gatherings reflected and sometimes challenged the hierarchical structure of medieval society. While seating arrangements and speaking order usually followed social rank, the shared experience of listening to stories created temporary communities where normal social barriers were somewhat relaxed. Children and adults, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, all gathered together to hear the same stories. The storyteller had to accommodate this diverse audience by including content that would appeal to different age groups, social classes, and levels of sophistication. The best storytellers developed techniques for layering their narratives so that different audience members could find different meanings in the same story. Women's participation in storytelling culture was complex and varied by region and social class. While most professional storytellers were men, women played important roles as audience members, story preservers, and sometimes as performers in more intimate settings. Many folk tales and family stories were passed down through generations of women, who served as unofficial keepers of cultural memory. Some women became professional storytellers, though they often faced additional challenges and restrictions compared to their male counterparts. Female storytellers were sometimes suspected of being witches, especially if their stories included supernatural elements, or if they seemed to have unusually good memories for ancient lore. The seasonal rhythm of medieval storytelling reflected the agricultural calendar and the availability of audiences. Winter was the peak season for storytelling, when communities were gathered indoors for long periods and had time for extended entertainment sessions. Summer storytelling was often limited to festivals, markets, and other special occasions when people had time to spare from agricultural work. Different seasons called for different types of stories. Winter storytelling often featured long, complex narratives that could fill entire evenings and help communities pass the dark months. Spring stories celebrated renewal and new beginnings. Summer tales were often shorter and more action-packed, suitable for outdoor festivals and brief entertainment breaks. Autumn stories reflected themes of harvest, preparation for winter, and the cycle of life and death. The technological limitations of medieval society actually enhanced the storytelling experience in some ways. Without artificial lighting, written scripts, or mechanical amplification, storytellers had to rely entirely on their voices, gestures, and the power of their narratives to hold audiences. This created an intimate, participatory atmosphere that modern entertainment often lacks. Storytelling sessions took place by firelight or candlelight, which created dramatic shadows and flickering illumination that enhanced the mood of the stories. The acoustic properties of medieval buildings, with their stone walls and high ceilings, provided natural amplification that allowed skilled storytellers to project their voices to large audiences without mechanical assistance. The preservation of storytelling traditions depended entirely on human memory and the continuity of oral transmission. When a master storyteller died without passing on their repertoire, entire story cycles could disappear forever. This made the storytelling tradition both remarkably stable, since popular stories could survive for centuries, and extremely fragile, since they existed only in the memories of individual performers. Some storytelling traditions were eventually written down, but the written versions often captured only the basic plot outlines rather than the full performance techniques, audience interactions, and cultural contexts that made oral storytelling compelling. Reading a medieval story collection gives only a pale impression of what the original storytelling experience must have been like. The economic impact of storytelling on medieval communities was significant, but often overlooked. Storytelling events brought people together for social and commercial activities that extended far beyond the entertainment itself. Markets, festivals, and other economic activities often organized around storytelling performances, which served as focal points for community gathering. Professional storytellers also contributed to local economies by attracting visitors from other communities, stimulating demand for food and lodging, and creating opportunities for other entertainers and merchants. A skilled storyteller could single-handedly boost the economic activity of a small town by drawing audiences from surrounding areas. The international character of storytelling culture helped spread stories, ideas, and cultural practices across linguistic and political boundaries. Stories that originated in one culture would be adapted and retold in others, creating international networks of shared narratives that helped create common cultural references across medieval Europe. Some stories became so popular that they existed in dozens of different language versions and cultural adaptations. The Arthurian legends, for example, were told in Celtic, French, German, English, and Italian versions, each adapted to local cultural values and political circumstances, while maintaining core narrative elements that made them recognizable across cultures. The relationship between storytelling and other forms of medieval entertainment was complex and interconnected. Storytellers often incorporated songs, music, and dramatic performances into their narratives. They collaborated with musicians, dancers, and other entertainers to create multimedia performances that combined multiple art forms. Some stories were specifically designed to be performed with musical accompaniment, and storytellers would work with musicians to coordinate their performances. Others included dance sequences, dramatic dialogue, or audience participation elements that transformed storytelling sessions into theatrical productions. The moral and religious dimensions of medieval storytelling were always present, even in seemingly secular entertainment. Stories were expected to provide moral instruction and reinforce social values. But the most skilled storytellers could embed these lessons in narratives that were primarily entertaining rather than preachy. Religious authorities had complicated relationships with secular storytelling. On one hand, They valued stories that reinforced Christian values and moral teachings. On the other hand, they worried about stories that contained pagan elements, promoted secular values, or diverted attention from religious instruction. Some storytellers specialized in religious content, developing repertoires of saints' lives, biblical stories, and moral tales that were explicitly designed to support Christian teaching. Others focused on secular content, but were careful to frame their stories in ways that didn't conflict with religious doctrine. The legacy of medieval storytelling can be seen in many aspects of modern entertainment culture. The techniques for adapting stories to different audiences, creating serial narratives that keep audiences engaged over long periods, and embedding social commentary in fictional narratives all have their roots in medieval storytelling traditions. Modern television series, with their complex multi-season story arcs, diverse characters, and ability to adapt to audience feedback, have more in common with medieval storytelling cycles than with any other historical entertainment form. The binge-watching phenomenon recreates something very similar to the medieval experience of listening to epic story cycles that could last for days. The interactive elements of modern social media, where audiences can comment on, share, and remix entertainment content, also echo the participatory nature of medieval storytelling. The difference is that modern technology allows these interactions to happen across vast distances and time periods, while medieval storytelling required physical presence and real-time participation. So the next time you binge-watch a television series, listen to a podcast, or get lost in a good book, remember that you're participating in a tradition that goes back over 1,000 years. The medieval storyteller who could captivate an audience for hours with nothing but their voice and their memory was doing essentially the same thing as your favorite content creator, just with different technology. The human need for compelling narratives that entertain, inform, and bring communities together hasn't changed at all. Medieval people didn't have vacation days, sick leave, or weekends off, but they had something that might have been even better. A calendar packed with seasonal celebrations that could last for days or even weeks. These weren't just religious holidays or brief breaks from work. They were elaborate, community-wide festivals that transformed ordinary villages into temporary entertainment capitals and gave people reasons to survive the hardships of medieval life. Winter festivities were particularly important because they provided light, warmth, and social connection during the darkest and most difficult months of the year. The 12 Days of Christmas weren't just a song lyric. They represented nearly 2 weeks of continuous celebration that helped communities survive the psychological challenges of winter isolation and food scarcity. The Christmas season began long before December 25th and extended well into January. Communities would spend weeks preparing special foods, decorating their homes and churches, and organizing entertainment activities that would keep everyone's spirits up during the coldest part of the year. The goal wasn't just to mark religious observances, but to create enough joy and social bonding to carry people through until spring arrived. Indoor entertainment during winter months became highly creative out of necessity. People developed elaborate games that could be played in small spaces with minimal equipment. Storytelling sessions could last entire nights, with different community members taking turns to share tales, songs, and memories. Riddle contests, word games, and memory challenges provided mental stimulation during long periods of confinement. Some winter games involved the entire community and could continue for days. Mock trials where community members playfully accused each other of ridiculous crimes became popular entertainment that also served as social pressure valves. People could air grievances and settle minor disputes through humor, rather than conflict. The Lord of Misrule tradition turned social hierarchies upside down for extended periods during winter celebrations. A person of low social status would be temporarily elevated to a position of mock authority and given license to make jokes about their social superiors, organize community activities, and generally behave in ways that would be impossible during normal times. Winter feasting presented unique challenges and opportunities for medieval communities. Food preservation techniques meant that winter was often the time when special preserved foods were finally consumed. Communities would pool their resources to create elaborate shared meals that featured foods that had been prepared months in advance specifically for winter celebrations. The brewing and consumption of special winter beverages became an art form in many communities. Wassailing, the practice of going from house to house singing songs and sharing drinks, created networks of social obligation and community bonding that helped ensure everyone had access to warmth and companionship during difficult times. But winter entertainment wasn't just about surviving harsh weather. It was also about preparing for the coming year and reinforcing social bonds that would be essential for community survival. Winter celebrations included planning sessions for spring activities, matchmaking opportunities for young people, and negotiations for the coming year's agricultural cooperation. Spring celebrations marked the transition from survival mode to growth mode, and were characterized by explosive releases of energy and enthusiasm that had been building up during the winter months. May Day celebrations were particularly elaborate and could transform entire communities into temporary festival grounds. The May Day tradition of gathering flowers and greenery before dawn created opportunities for young people to spend unsupervised time together in romantic settings. What happened during these early morning expeditions was the subject of considerable speculation and gossip. But it was generally understood that May Day provided socially acceptable opportunities for courtship activities that might be prohibited at other times. Maypole dancing was far more complex and sophisticated than modern people often realize. The intricate patterns created by dancers weaving ribbons around tall poles required coordination, practice, and considerable skill. These dances were community-wide cooperative activities that reinforced social bonds and provided opportunities for people of different ages and social classes to work together toward common goals. The selection of May queens and kings created temporary alternative social hierarchies that allowed communities to experiment with different leadership structures and social arrangements. These mock monarchies were usually brief and largely ceremonial, but they provided insights into community values and preferences that weren't always apparent in normal social arrangements. Spring festivals also included elaborate competitions and contests that showcased individual skills while entertaining entire communities. Archery contests, wrestling matches, foot races, and other athletic competitions provided opportunities for people to demonstrate their abilities and compete for prizes and social recognition. The agricultural aspects of spring celebrations were never far from the surface, even when they were disguised as entertainment activities. Many spring games and contests were actually training exercises that helped people develop skills they would need for successful farming. Others were ritual activities designed to ensure good harvests through sympathetic magic or divine favor. Summer celebrations took advantage of warm weather and long daylight hours to create outdoor entertainment experiences that were impossible during other seasons. Village fairs became major social and economic events that combined entertainment, commerce, and social networking in ways that served multiple community functions simultaneously. The traveling entertainment circuit that developed around summer fairs created a medieval version of the modern entertainment industry. Professional performers, merchants, craftsmen, and service providers would follow established routes from fair to fair, creating temporary entertainment economies that could support hundreds of people for months at a time. Summer fairs featured entertainment activities that required space, good weather, and large audiences. Animal performances, elaborate theatrical productions, and large-scale sporting events were scheduled around fair seasons when communities could provide the necessary logistical support and audiences could travel from surrounding areas. The competitive aspects of summer entertainment became increasingly sophisticated as communities vied with each other to host the most impressive festivals and attract the largest audiences. This competition drove innovation in entertainment techniques and created incentives for communities to invest in permanent infrastructure that could support major entertainment events. Summer was also the season for pilgrimage, which combined religious observance with travel, social networking, and entertainment activities. Pilgrimage routes became entertainment corridors where travelers could expect to find food, lodging, and amusement designed to make their journeys more pleasant and profitable for local communities. The social mixing that occurred during summer celebrations was more extensive than at other times of the year. People from different communities, social classes, and occupations would come together in ways that created temporary social environments very different from normal medieval hierarchies. Harvest celebrations marked the culmination of the agricultural year and provided opportunities for communities to celebrate their survival and success while preparing for the coming winter. These festivals combined genuine thanksgiving with elaborate entertainment activities that reinforced community bonds before the isolation of winter set in again. The competitive aspects of harvest celebrations often centered around demonstrations of agricultural skill and productivity. Communities would compete to see who had grown the largest vegetables, produced the best ale, or achieved the most successful harvests. These competitions served both entertainment and educational functions by sharing agricultural knowledge and techniques. Harvest festivals also included elaborate food preservation and preparation activities that were both necessary work and community entertainment. The communal processing of large quantities of food created opportunities for socializing, storytelling, and celebration that made essential work more enjoyable. The timing of harvest celebrations varied significantly based on local agricultural cycles and weather conditions, which meant that different communities celebrated at different times and could participate in each other's festivals. This created extended celebration seasons that could last for months as different communities reached their harvest peaks. The generosity and abundance displayed during harvest celebrations served important social functions beyond just entertainment. Communities that could host elaborate harvest festivals demonstrated their prosperity and success to neighboring communities, which had implications for trade relationships, political alliances, and social status. But harvest celebrations also included elements of preparation for winter hardships, an acknowledgement that the cycle of abundance and scarcity would continue. The entertainment activities during harvest festivals often included themes of preparing for difficult times and maintaining community solidarity through challenges. The religious dimensions of seasonal celebrations were always present, but were often integrated with secular entertainment activities in ways that made the boundaries between sacred and profane quite fluid. Church authorities generally supported seasonal celebrations as long as they reinforced community values and didn't conflict too obviously with Christian teachings. Some seasonal celebrations preserved ancient pagan traditions that had been only superficially Christianized. These underlying pre-Christian elements added depth and complexity to seasonal entertainment that connected medieval communities to much older cultural traditions. The economic impact of seasonal celebrations on medieval communities was enormous, but often underestimated. These festivals required months of preparation, significant financial investment, and extensive cooperation between different segments of the community. The economic activity generated by major seasonal celebrations could represent a significant portion of a community's annual commerce. The social insurance functions of seasonal celebrations were particularly important in medieval society, where formal support systems were limited. Communities that celebrated together were more likely to cooperate during emergencies, share resources during difficult times, and maintain the social cohesion necessary for collective survival. So the next time you attend a seasonal festival, participate in a community celebration, or even just enjoy a holiday with family and friends, remember that you're continuing traditions that helped medieval communities survive and thrive for centuries. The specific activities may have changed, but the fundamental human need for regular celebration, community bonding, and seasonal marking of time remains exactly the same. Not every medieval celebration ended with satisfied villagers stumbling home to their beds with full bellies and happy hearts. Sometimes the fun went too far. Sometimes entertainment became a monster that devoured the very communities it was meant to serve. And sometimes, what started as innocent revelry transformed into something dark enough to haunt a town for generations. Picture this. It's May Day 1517 in London, and what should have been a joyful spring celebration has turned into one of the most violent riots in English history. The evil May Day riots began with traditional festivities, but escalated into xenophobic violence that left dozens dead and hundreds imprisoned. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval entertainment had a disturbing tendency to cross the line from celebration to catastrophe, often without warning. The transformation usually followed a predictable pattern. A festival would begin normally, with the usual games, drinking, and merrymaking. But as alcohol flowed and social tensions simmered just beneath the surface, the mood could shift in an instant. A perceived insult, a disputed game result, or even just the wrong person making the wrong joke at the wrong moment could ignite violence that spread like wildfire through the crowd. Harvest festivals were particularly prone to chaos. These celebrations brought together people from different villages, social classes, and sometimes even different ethnic groups. When you mixed territorial rivalries with alcohol and competition, the results were often explosive. What started as friendly contests between neighboring villages could escalate into pitched battles involving hundreds of participants wielding farm tools as weapons. The famous Shrovetide football matches were legendary for their violence. These weren't games in any modern sense. They were organized riots where entire towns split into opposing teams and battled for control of a ball using any means necessary. Properties were destroyed, bones were broken, and occasionally people died. Yet communities continued organizing these events year after year, because somehow the social bonding that occurred through shared violence was considered worth the cost. Authorities tried repeatedly to control these dangerous celebrations, but their efforts often backfired spectacularly. Banning popular entertainment usually made people more determined to pursue it, and when they did, the forbidden nature of the activity made it even more likely to turn violent. It's like telling teenagers they can't have a party. They'll find a way to have one anyway, and it'll probably be twice as wild because it's forbidden. The church found itself in an impossible position. Many of the most dangerous entertainments were connected to religious festivals. The Feast of Fools, where social hierarchies were temporarily reversed, regularly got out of hand. Servants would mock their masters so viciously that the mockery turned into genuine rebellion. Mock bishops would issue decrees that people took seriously. What began as sanctioned carnival could become actual sedition. Dancing plagues represent perhaps the most extreme example of entertainment gone horribly wrong. These weren't isolated incidents, but recurring phenomena that struck medieval communities with terrifying regularity. The most famous occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in the street and couldn't stop. Within days, dozens of others had joined her, dancing frantically for hours without rest. Within a month, approximately 400 people were dancing themselves toward exhaustion and death. The authorities' response to the dancing plague reveals how little they understood about mass hysteria. Instead of trying to stop the dancing, they hired musicians and built stages, believing that more dancing would cure the afflicted. They were essentially pouring gasoline on a fire. People danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and heart failure. Historical records suggest that at least 15 people died from dancing during the 1518 outbreak alone. These dancing plagues weren't limited to one region or time period. Similar outbreaks occurred throughout medieval Europe, always following the same pattern. One person would begin dancing compulsively, others would join them, and the phenomenon would spread through the community like a contagious disease. Modern psychologists believe these were cases of mass psychogenic illness, where psychological stress manifested as physical symptoms that spread through suggestion and social pressure. What makes the dancing plagues particularly relevant to our discussion is how they reveal the dark side of medieval community entertainment. The same social bonds that made celebrations so powerful and meaningful could also transmit psychological contagion. The intense group experiences that normally brought joy and solidarity could, under the right circumstances, spread madness instead. Medieval entertainment served as a form of social control, but not always in the way authorities intended. Rulers understood that providing bread in circuses could keep their subjects distracted from political problems. But they often lost control of the very spectacles they sponsored. Public executions, meant to demonstrate the power of law and order, sometimes turned into sympathetic demonstrations for the condemned. Bear baiting events, designed to channel aggression away from the ruling class, occasionally became rallying points for social unrest. The Roman poet Juvenal coined the phrase bread and circuses to describe how rulers could placate their subjects by providing food and entertainment. Medieval authorities took this lesson to heart, but they discovered that managing public entertainment was like trying to control wildfire. You could start it, but you couldn't always predict where it would spread or how much damage it would cause before burning itself out. Tournament culture exemplifies how entertainment could become a tool of political control while simultaneously undermining that control. Nobles organized tournaments partly to display their wealth and power, creating spectacular demonstrations of aristocratic superiority. But tournaments also provided a legitimate outlet for noble violence that might otherwise be directed against the crown. By encouraging nobles to fight each other in controlled settings, rulers hoped to prevent them from organizing against royal authority. This strategy worked until it didn't. Tournaments became breeding grounds for political conspiracies and aristocratic rivalries. Secret alliances were formed, grievances were aired, and sometimes the violence spilled beyond the tournament ground into actual rebellion. The very spectacles meant to demonstrate royal power became forums for organizing opposition to that power. The casualties of medieval entertainment extended far beyond the occasional tournament death or dancing plague victim. Entire communities could be economically devastated by the cost of their own celebrations. Villages would spend months preparing for a major festival, investing resources they couldn't afford in decorations, food, and entertainment. The social pressure to participate was enormous. Families would go into debt to contribute to community celebrations, because being seen as stingy or uncommitted to the community was social suicide. Professional entertainers faced their own unique dangers. Traveling minstrels and performers lived precarious lives, dependent on the goodwill of audiences who could turn hostile without warning. A singer who chose the wrong song, a juggler who made a political joke that fell flat, or an acrobat who accidentally injured a spectator could find themselves beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Female entertainers faced additional risks that their male counterparts rarely encountered. Women who performed in public were automatically suspected of prostitution, regardless of their actual behavior. This stigma made them vulnerable to violence from both authorities and audience members. A female performer who was too successful might be accused of witchcraft, while one who failed to please might be assaulted for her inadequacy. The legal system offered little protection for entertainers. They existed outside normal social structures, belonging to no fixed community and enjoying none of the protections that came with stable social relationships. If a traveling performer was robbed, assaulted, or even murdered, there was often no one to seek justice on their behalf and no community to demand accountability. Children's participation in dangerous entertainment reveals another dark aspect of medieval fun. Young people weren't protected from violent spectacles the way modern children are. They were active participants in blood sports, both as spectators and sometimes as participants. Children were present at public executions, animal baiting events, and judicial duels, absorbing lessons about violence, power, and social hierarchy that would shape their worldview for life. Child performers faced exploitation that would horrify modern sensibilities. Young acrobats and dancers were valued precisely because their youth made their performances more impressive and their potential injuries more shocking. A child who could perform dangerous stunts was a valuable commodity, and there were few regulations protecting them from abuse or overwork. The psychological impact of medieval entertainment on its participants is something historians are only beginning to understand. Regular exposure to extreme violence, whether as entertainment or punishment, likely produced forms of trauma that medieval people had no framework for understanding or treating. Communities that regularly gathered to watch people die, animals suffer, or neighbors fight might have developed collective psychological patterns that perpetuated cycles of violence. Modern research on the effects of violent entertainment suggests that repeated exposure to brutal spectacles can desensitize people to suffering and normalize aggressive behavior. If this is true, then medieval communities may have trapped themselves in cycles where violent entertainment created more violent people, who then demanded more violent entertainment to achieve the same level of excitement. The economics of dangerous entertainment created perverse incentives that made tragedies more likely. Organizers of spectacles discovered that audiences paid more and attended in larger numbers when the risk of genuine harm was higher. This created pressure to make entertainment increasingly dangerous, pushing the boundaries of what performers and participants could survive. Gambling added another layer of corruption to medieval entertainment. When large sums of money were at stake, the temptation to fix results became overwhelming. Bears might be drugged to make them more or less aggressive, depending on betting patterns. Dice games were rigged so systematically that honest games became almost impossible to find. Athletic competitions were manipulated through bribery, intimidation, or sabotage. The social cost of entertainment-related gambling was enormous. Families were destroyed when breadwinners lost everything on a single cockfight or dice game. Villages were impoverished when too many residents wagered their resources on entertainment that was secretly rigged against them. Some communities banned gambling entirely, but enforcement was nearly impossible when the authorities themselves were often the biggest gamblers. Disease spread was another hidden danger of medieval entertainment. Large gatherings of people from different regions created perfect conditions for transmitting infections. Festival goers would return to their home communities carrying diseases they'd picked up at celebrations, turning entertainment events into vectors for epidemic illness. The Black Death spread partly through trade routes, but also through the networks of traveling entertainers and festival circuits that connected medieval communities. Weather-related disasters were a constant threat to outdoor entertainment. Medieval people had no reliable weather prediction, so festivals and gatherings were always vulnerable to sudden storms, floods, or temperature extremes. Temporary structures built for entertainment were often poorly constructed and dangerous in bad weather. Crowds seeking shelter from sudden storms could be trampled or crushed in the panic. Fire was perhaps the greatest danger facing medieval entertainment venues. Most structures were built of wood and thatch, illuminated by open flames, and packed with people who had been drinking. Fires could spread through crowded entertainment venues in minutes, trapping hundreds of people with no modern fire safety measures to protect them. Records of major fires at festivals and celebrations appear regularly in medieval chronicles, suggesting that these disasters were unfortunately common. The aftermath of entertainment disasters reveals how medieval communities dealt with collective trauma. When celebrations turned deadly, communities faced a terrible choice. They could abandon the entertainment that had brought tragedy, breaking traditions that might stretch back generations. Or they could continue the celebrations, accepting that occasional disasters were the price of maintaining their cultural practices. Most communities chose to continue their dangerous entertainments, often with only minor modifications. The social and cultural functions these activities served were simply too important to abandon, even when the human cost was clear. This decision reveals something profound about medieval priorities and values. Community cohesion and cultural continuity were considered more important than individual safety. Modern people might judge these choices harshly, but we face similar trade-offs in our own entertainment culture. We continue to drive cars to sporting events despite traffic fatalities, attend concerts despite crowd disasters, and participate in recreational activities despite known risks. The specific dangers have changed, but the fundamental calculation hasn't. We accept certain levels of risk as the price of the entertainment and community experiences we value. Perhaps what's most disturbing about the dark side of medieval entertainment isn't the violence or the death toll, but how normal it all seemed to the people involved. Communities that regularly gathered to watch public executions, animal torture, and violent competitions weren't necessarily more cruel or callous than modern people. They had simply normalized different levels of violence and risk as acceptable parts of community life. This normalization process reveals something important about human psychology and social dynamics. People can adapt to almost any level of danger or brutality if they're exposed to it gradually, and if it's presented as normal or necessary. Medieval entertainment culture didn't emerge overnight. It developed slowly, with each generation accepting slightly higher levels of violence and risk, until behaviors that would shock us became routine. The surveillance aspect of medieval entertainment created its own form of social control and danger. Public gatherings were opportunities for authorities to monitor their subjects, but they were also opportunities for subversive ideas to spread. The same crowds that cheered for public executions might also listen to traveling performers spreading seditious songs or revolutionary ideas. Informants and spies were common at medieval entertainment events, looking for signs of disloyalty or rebellion. This created an atmosphere of paranoia that could turn festive gatherings into tense, suspicious affairs. People had to be careful about what they said, whom they associated with, and how they reacted to entertainment that might have political implications. The seasonal nature of many medieval entertainments meant that communities were regularly exposed to these dangers. It wasn't just a one-time risk, but an ongoing hazard that people faced multiple times per year. Each festival season brought new opportunities for celebrations to turn violent, for gambling to destroy families, for diseases to spread, and for accidents to claim lives. Yet despite all these dangers, medieval people continued to pursue entertainment with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. The alternative, a life without celebration, music, games, or spectacle, was apparently worse than accepting the risks that came with communal fun. This suggests something profound about human nature and our fundamental need for shared experiences that transcend the mundane struggles of daily life. So the next time you attend a crowded event, watch a sporting competition, or participate in a community celebration, remember that you're engaging in activities that have always carried hidden dangers. We've gotten better at managing some of these risks, but we haven't eliminated them entirely. The fundamental tension between safety and excitement, between individual welfare and community experience, remains as relevant today as it was in medieval times. The difference is that we now have better emergency services, but medieval people had stronger community bonds to support them through the aftermath of disaster. Childhood in the medieval world was not the protected, innocent phase of life we imagine today. Children were small adults in training, and their entertainment reflected this reality in ways that might disturb modern parents. From the moment they could walk and talk, medieval children were being prepared for a world that was harsh, unpredictable, and often violent. Their games, songs, and stories served as boot camp for adult life, teaching lessons about survival, social hierarchy, and the brutal realities they would soon face. Take the simple game of King of the Castle, still played by children today. In medieval times, this wasn't just innocent fun. Children would fight genuinely fierce battles to claim and defend elevated positions, using sticks as weapons and accepting real bruises as the price of victory. The game taught valuable lessons about territorial defense, leadership under pressure, and the importance of holding strategic positions. What looks like play to us was actually military training disguised as entertainment. Medieval children played with toys that reflected their future roles with startling directness. Little girls received dolls that weren't just for cuddling, but for practicing the maternal skills they would need to keep their own children alive in a world with terrifying infant mortality rates. These dolls came with tiny clothes that had to be sewn, mended, and maintained, teaching domestic skills that would literally mean the difference between life and death for future families. Boys received toy weapons that were scaled-down versions of real instruments of war. Miniature swords, bows, and shields weren't just playthings, but training tools. Children learned to handle these weapons with increasing skill, progressing from wooden practice swords to sharp metal blades as they grew older. By the time they reached adolescence, many boys were genuinely dangerous with weapons, having spent years perfecting their techniques through what they thought was just play. The seasonal games children played reveal how deeply connected medieval entertainment was to survival skills. Winter games often involved finding and hoarding resources, teaching children about the scarcity that defined cold months. Spring games focused on growth, planting, and renewal, preparing children for agricultural responsibilities. Summer games emphasized physical endurance and competition, while autumn games centered on harvest skills and preparation for winter's return. One of the most popular medieval children's games was Hoodman Blind, an early version of Blind Man's Bluff. But this wasn't the gentle, giggling game modern children play. Medieval children played it with genuine intensity, using it to develop the heightened senses and spatial awareness that could save their lives in a world where dangers lurked in every shadow. The child who was it learned to identify people by their breathing, their footsteps, and their scent, skills that would serve them well in adulthood. Children's games often involved elements of genuine danger that would horrify modern parents. Hot cockles required one child to lie face down while others struck them with sticks, and the prone child had to guess who had hit them. This wasn't just entertainment, but training in enduring pain, reading social cues, and understanding power dynamics. The child who couldn't handle the physical discomfort or couldn't correctly identify their tormentors learned valuable lessons about vulnerability and the importance of paying attention to potential threats. Medieval children played elaborate games of church and chapel, where they would recreate religious ceremonies with surprisingly sophisticated understanding of ritual and hierarchy. These games weren't just imitation, but preparation for adult participation in religious life. Children learned the proper order of ceremonies, the appropriate responses to different parts of the liturgy, and the complex social relationships that defined medieval religious communities. The gender divisions in medieval children's entertainment were stark and began early. Boys and girls rarely played the same games, and when they did, they played different roles within those games. This wasn't just social preference, but deliberate preparation for adult lives that would be rigidly divided by gender. Boys learned competition, aggression, and leadership through their games, while girls learned cooperation, nurturing, and domestic management through theirs. Children's songs and rhymes carried messages that would shock modern listeners with their darkness and violence. Ring Around the Rosie may have originated as a children's response to the Black Death. With ashes, ashes, we all fall down, representing the reality of mass mortality that medieval children witnessed regularly. These songs helped children process traumatic experiences and normalize the presence of death in their daily lives. Lullabies meant to soothe medieval children often contained surprisingly sinister themes. Rockabye Baby warns of a cradle falling from a tree, while Goosey Goosey Gander tells of throwing old men downstairs. These weren't accidents, but deliberate attempts to prepare children for a world where violence and sudden death were constant possibilities. Parents sang these dark lullabies not to frighten their children, but to gradually introduce them to life's harsh realities. The stories told to medieval children were far more brutal than the sanitized fairy tales we know today. Original versions of stories like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty contained graphic violence, sexual themes, and moral lessons that emphasized survival over happiness. These stories weren't meant to entertain so much as to educate, teaching children about the dangers they would face and the strategies they would need to survive. Children learned through these stories that the world was divided into predators and prey, that beauty and goodness didn't guarantee safety, and that cleverness and determination were more valuable than innocence and trust. The wicked stepmother, the evil witch, and the dangerous wolf weren't just fictional monsters, but representations of real threats that children would encounter in their lives. Medieval children's entertainment included participation in adult spectacles that would be considered completely inappropriate today. Children attended public executions, animal baiting events, and violent sports competitions. They weren't passive observers but active participants, cheering for their favorites and learning about justice, power, and social hierarchy through these brutal displays. Young children were often lifted onto shoulders or placed in trees to get better views of executions, with parents pointing out the moral lessons being demonstrated. "See what happens to thieves, little Mary," they would whisper as the condemned man was led to the gallows. These experiences were considered essential education, teaching children about law, order, and the consequences of breaking social rules. Children's participation in religious festivals often involved elements that would seem disturbing to modern eyes. During certain feast days, children would participate in mock trials, complete with accusations, testimony, and punishment. These weren't just games, but training in legal processes and social judgment. Children learned how to present evidence, how to cross-examine witnesses, and how to determine guilt or innocence through these elaborate entertainments. The boy bishop tradition, where a child was elected to serve as a mock bishop during certain religious festivals, gave children temporary authority over adults. But this wasn't just fun and games. The child bishop had to perform real religious duties, make actual decisions about community disputes, and exercise genuine authority. This experience taught children about leadership, responsibility, and the complex relationships between power and duty. Medieval children's games often involved elements of genuine economic activity. Children would set up mock markets, complete with negotiations, trades, and disputes. They learned about currency, value, and commerce through these games. But they also learned about deception, fraud, and the importance of being able to detect when someone was trying to cheat them. The apprenticeship system meant that childhood ended early for most medieval children, but their training began even earlier through entertainment. Children as young as 7 or 8 would begin learning their future trades through games that gradually became more serious and skill-based. A blacksmith's son would play with toy hammers and anvils, learning the rhythms and techniques he would need as an adult. Children's seasonal entertainment reflected the agricultural calendar that dominated medieval life. Spring games involved planting and growth. Summer games emphasized work and endurance. Autumn games focused on harvest and preparation. And winter games dealt with survival and resource management. These games weren't just fun, but preparation for adult responsibilities that would be literally matters of life and death. The oral tradition played a crucial role in medieval children's entertainment. Children learned songs, stories, and rhymes that carried cultural knowledge, historical information, and practical wisdom. These weren't just entertainment, but education, passing down important information about everything from weather patterns to social relationships to survival skills. Regional variations in children's entertainment reveal how different communities prepared their young people for different challenges. Children in coastal areas played games that involved sailing, swimming, and fishing skills. Children in mountainous regions played games that emphasized climbing, tracking, and surviving in harsh terrain. Children in urban areas played games that involved trade, negotiation, and navigating complex social hierarchies. The toys medieval children played with were often miniature versions of adult tools and weapons. A child's toy plow wasn't just a plaything, but a training device for learning agricultural techniques. A child's toy loom wasn't just entertainment, but preparation for textile production. Even seemingly innocent toys like tops and balls served purposes beyond simple fun, developing hand-eye coordination and physical skills that would be essential in adult life. Medieval children's entertainment included elements of genuine danger that served as training for adult risks. Children would play games that involved climbing dangerous structures, crossing treacherous terrain, or handling potentially harmful materials. These weren't accidents, but deliberate preparation for adult life in a world where safety was never guaranteed. The social aspects of medieval children's entertainment were as important as the individual skills being developed. Children learned through play how to form alliances, how to compete without destroying relationships, and how to maintain group cohesion while pursuing individual goals. These social skills were essential for survival in communities where cooperation was necessary for everyone's survival. Children's games often involved elements of genuine magic and superstition that reflected adult beliefs about the supernatural world. Children would play games designed to ward off evil spirits, ensure good fortune, or communicate with the dead. These weren't just imaginative play, but training in the magical thinking that was an important part of medieval adult life. The transition from childhood to adulthood in medieval times was marked by changes in entertainment that reflected new responsibilities and dangers. Children's games gradually gave way to adult pursuits, but the lessons learned through play remained essential throughout life. The child who learned to endure pain through hot cockles became the adult who could survive torture. The child who learned strategy through King of the Castle became the adult who could navigate political conflicts. Medieval children's entertainment reveals a worldview that prioritized survival, community, and practical skills over individual happiness or innocent fun. Children were expected to grow up quickly and to be prepared for a world that was harsh, unpredictable, and often brutal. Their games, songs, and stories reflected this reality, serving as boot camp for adult life rather than escape from it. The preservation of medieval children's entertainment through oral tradition means that many of these games, songs, and stories have survived to the present day, though often in modified forms. Modern versions of medieval children's games often retain elements of the original lessons, even when we no longer recognize their educational purposes. What's most striking about medieval children's entertainment is how it prepared young people for adult realities without crushing their spirits or destroying their capacity for joy. Medieval children learned to find fun in activities that taught essential survival skills, to derive pleasure from games that prepared them for hardship, and to develop social bonds through shared experiences that would sustain them through adult challenges. The community aspect of medieval children's entertainment was particularly important. Children didn't just play alone or in small groups, but as part of larger community activities that included adults, older children, and even elders. This multi-generational participation ensured that knowledge and skills were transmitted effectively, while maintaining the social bonds that held medieval communities together. So the next time you watch children at play, notice how their games reflect the adult world they're preparing to enter. Whether they're playing house, pretending to be superheroes, or competing in sports, they're engaged in the same fundamental process that medieval children experienced, learning about adult life through entertainment. The specific skills being developed may have changed, but the essential function of children's entertainment remains the same: preparing young people for the world they will inherit, while allowing them to find joy and meaning in the process of growing up. Behind every medieval spectacle, every village festival, and every traveling minstrel's performance lay a complex web of economic relationships that would make modern entertainment executives dizzy with envy or despair. Medieval entertainment wasn't just about having fun. It was a sophisticated economic system that moved vast amounts of money, created entire industries, and sometimes determined the financial fate of entire communities. Understanding who paid for medieval fun reveals as much about the power structures and social priorities of the time as any political treaty or religious doctrine. Let's start with the most expensive entertainment of all, the tournament. A single major tournament could cost more than building a castle, and the financial commitment didn't end with the initial investment. Lords who wanted to host tournaments had to consider expenses that would make modern event planners weep. There was the construction of temporary stands for spectators, the provision of food and drink for thousands of visitors, the hiring of professional entertainers to fill the gaps between competitions, and the prize money that attracted the best knights from across Europe. But the real expense lay in participation. A knight's tournament equipment was phenomenally expensive, representing an investment equivalent to several years' income for a wealthy merchant. A destrier, the massive warhorse bred specifically for tournament combat, could cost as much as a small farm. The armor, custom-fitted and decorated with precious metals, represented months of skilled craftsmanship. The weapons, the heraldic banners, the pavilion where the knight rested between events, all of these required enormous financial resources. This created an entire economy around tournament culture. Armorers, horse breeders, weaponsmiths, banner makers, and tent manufacturers all depended on the tournament circuit for their livelihoods. Professional knights traveled from tournament to tournament like modern athletes, earning prize money and sponsorship deals with wealthy patrons who wanted to be associated with successful competitors. The sponsorship system was remarkably sophisticated. Wealthy merchants, minor nobles, and even entire cities would sponsor knights in exchange for the prestige of association with tournament winners. A successful knight could earn enough prize money and sponsorship deals to live quite comfortably, while an unsuccessful one could go bankrupt trying to maintain the equipment and lifestyle necessary to compete. Village festivals operated on completely different economic principles, but were no less complex in their financial arrangements. These celebrations were typically funded through a combination of community contributions, church support, and merchant investment. Every household was expected to contribute something, whether money, food, labor, or materials. The social pressure to participate was enormous because being seen as ungenerous or uncommitted to the community was social suicide. The guild system played a crucial role in financing urban entertainment. Different craft guilds would compete to sponsor the most elaborate floats, performances, or competitions during major festivals. This wasn't just community spirit, but shrewd business investment. The guild that put on the most impressive display would attract the most attention, potentially leading to increased business and higher status within the community. Merchants understood that festivals were opportunities to make substantial profits from visitors who came specifically to spend money on entertainment. They would stock up on special foods, decorative items, and luxury goods that people might purchase as treats during celebrations. The most successful merchants planned their inventory and pricing strategies around the festival calendar, sometimes making half their annual profits during a few weeks of major celebrations. The church's financial relationship with entertainment was complicated and often contradictory. Officially, the church condemned many forms of popular entertainment as sinful or dangerous. Practically, many churches depended on entertainment-related donations for their survival. Religious festivals brought in pilgrims who made offerings, purchased religious artifacts, and paid for special prayers or blessings. Some churches actually organized and profited from entertainments that they officially condemned. Church-sponsored festivals might include gambling, drinking, and other activities that were theoretically sinful, but practically necessary for raising funds. The Feast of Fools, where social hierarchies were temporarily reversed and mock religious ceremonies were performed, was both condemned by church authorities and sponsored by local parishes that needed the revenue it generated. The emergence of professional entertainers created entirely new economic relationships and social categories. Traveling minstrels, acrobats, jugglers, and storytellers existed outside the traditional feudal system, earning their living through direct payment from audiences rather than through land ownership or craft production. This made them economically independent in some ways, but also extremely vulnerable to economic downturns or changes in public taste. Professional entertainers developed sophisticated business strategies that would be familiar to modern performers. They created diversified repertoires that could appeal to different audiences, developed signature acts that distinguished them from competitors, and built relationships with patrons who could provide steady income and protection. The most successful entertainers became wealthy enough to hire assistants, purchase expensive equipment, and establish permanent bases of operation. The licensing and regulation of professional entertainers reveals how authorities tried to control and profit from entertainment. Many cities required traveling performers to purchase licenses, pay taxes on their earnings, and follow specific regulations about where and when they could perform. These requirements generated revenue for local governments while also providing a mechanism for controlling potentially subversive entertainment. Bear baiting and other animal combat sports created complex economic ecosystems that supported numerous professionals. Bear keepers bred, trained, and transported their animals from town to town. Dog breeders specialized in producing animals with the temperament and skills necessary for combat. Venue operators constructed and maintained the rings where events took place. Bookmakers organized betting and handled the substantial sums of money that changed hands during each event. The economics of animal combat sports reveal how entertainment could create perverse incentives that prioritized profit over animal welfare or public safety. Bears and dogs that were particularly successful in combat became valuable assets, leading to better care and training for successful animals, but also creating pressure to drug or mistreat animals to influence betting outcomes. Professional gambling created its own specialized economy with dealers, bookmakers, and enforcers, who ensured that debts were paid and rules were followed. The most successful gambling operations were sophisticated businesses that understood probability, managed risk, and maintained the trust necessary to keep customers coming back. They also had to navigate the complex legal environment, where gambling was simultaneously popular, profitable, and officially condemned. The seasonal nature of much medieval entertainment created boom and bust economic cycles that entire communities had to navigate. Festival seasons brought prosperity to innkeepers, food vendors, entertainers, and craftspeople who sold decorative items or special goods. But these same communities had to survive the lean periods between major celebrations when entertainment-related income disappeared. Some entrepreneurs developed strategies for smoothing out these seasonal variations. Traveling entertainers would follow circuits that took them to different communities at different times, ensuring steady income throughout the year. Skilled craftspeople would produce goods during slow periods that could be sold during festival seasons. Innkeepers would use festival profits to upgrade their facilities or expand their operations during off-seasons. The economic impact of entertainment extended far beyond the immediate participants. A major tournament or festival could attract thousands of visitors to a small town, creating demand for food, lodging, transportation, and services that benefited the entire local economy. Communities competed fiercely to host major entertainment events because of the economic benefits they brought. This competition led to an arms race of increasingly elaborate and expensive entertainments as communities tried to outdo each other to attract visitors. Towns would go into debt to finance spectacular festivals, gambling that the economic benefits would justify the costs. Sometimes this strategy worked, establishing communities as regular stops on entertainment circuits. Sometimes it led to financial disaster and bankruptcy. The taxation of entertainment provided revenue for both secular and religious authorities, but it also created ongoing conflicts over who had the right to profit from popular entertainments. Lords claimed the right to tax entertainment events held on their lands. Churches demanded tithes from entertainers' earnings. Cities wanted licensing fees and market taxes. Entertainers often found themselves paying multiple overlapping taxes and fees that could consume most of their profits. Some entertainers became skilled at navigating these complex taxation systems, developing relationships with authorities that allowed them to operate profitably while meeting their legal obligations. Others became essentially outlaws, avoiding taxes and regulations by operating in the margins of society. This created an underground entertainment economy that was difficult for authorities to monitor or control. The investment in entertainment infrastructure reveals how seriously medieval communities took their leisure activities. Permanent structures like bear baiting rings, tournament grounds, and festival stages represented substantial community investments that had to be justified economically. These facilities needed ongoing maintenance and security, creating permanent employment for specialized workers. The most elaborate entertainment venues rivaled religious or military structures in their complexity and cost. The tournament grounds at major courts included not just the lists where combat took place, but also elaborate pavilions for nobles, viewing stands for spectators, stables for hundreds of horses, and facilities for storing and maintaining equipment. These complexes represented investments equivalent to major public works projects. The economic relationships between entertainers and their audiences were more complex than simple payment for services. Entertainers often served as informal bankers, carrying money and valuable goods between communities. They provided news and information that had economic value for merchants and traders. They sometimes served as intermediaries in business deals or marriage negotiations. The most successful entertainers became integral parts of the economic networks that connected medieval communities. They understood market conditions in different regions, knew which goods were scarce or abundant in different areas, and could provide valuable intelligence about political and economic developments that might affect business opportunities. The decline of certain forms of medieval entertainment often reflected broader economic changes rather than shifts in public taste. As centralized governments became more powerful, they were better able to suppress entertainments that seemed politically dangerous. As trade networks became more sophisticated, communities became less dependent on traveling entertainers for news and information. As urban populations grew, new forms of entertainment emerged that better suited city life. The professionalization of entertainment during the later medieval period created new economic opportunities, but also new forms of competition and exploitation. As entertainment became more commercialized, successful performers could earn substantial incomes. But the barriers to entry became higher and the risks of failure became greater. The guild system eventually extended to entertainers, with musicians, actors, and other performers organizing to protect their economic interests and maintain professional standards. These entertainment guilds controlled training, regulated competition, and negotiated with authorities over licensing and taxation issues. The economic legacy of medieval entertainment extended well beyond the Middle Ages themselves. Many of the financial structures, business models, and economic relationships that developed around medieval entertainment became the foundation for modern entertainment industries. The patron-artist relationship, the tour circuit model, the licensing and regulation of performances, and the integration of entertainment with hospitality and tourism industries all have their roots in medieval innovations. What's most remarkable about the economics of medieval entertainment is how it created value and prosperity in communities that had limited resources and faced constant economic uncertainty. By investing in celebration, spectacle, and shared joy, medieval people created economic activity that improved their quality of life, while strengthening the social bonds that helped them survive in a harsh world. The financial risks that individuals and communities took to fund entertainment reveal how highly medieval people valued the social and psychological benefits of shared celebration. They were willing to go into debt, sacrifice other goods and services, and invest enormous amounts of time and energy in activities that produced no tangible goods, but created intangible benefits that they considered essential for community survival and individual well-being. So the next time you purchase tickets to a concert, attend a sporting event, or participate in a community festival, remember that you're participating in economic relationships that stretch back centuries. The specific mechanisms may have evolved, but the fundamental exchange remains the same. Communities investing their resources in shared experiences that create social bonds, cultural meaning, and psychological benefits that can't be measured in purely financial terms. Medieval people understood something that modern economists are only beginning to appreciate. Entertainment isn't just a luxury or a distraction from serious economic activity, but an essential component of the social infrastructure that makes all other economic activity possible. And so, as our journey through the strange and wonderful world of medieval entertainment draws to close, it's time to reflect on what we've discovered together. We've witnessed public executions that drew crowds like modern sporting events, dancing plagues that consumed entire communities, children's games that served as training for adult warfare, and economic systems that rivaled anything Wall Street might devise. What strikes me most about medieval entertainment is how it simultaneously celebrated and contained the wildest aspects of human behavior. These were communities that could gather to watch a man die horribly in the morning, then spend the afternoon playing gentle music and sharing stories around a fire. This wasn't moral confusion, but rather a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that we've largely forgotten. Medieval people understood that humans need outlets for both their gentle and violent impulses, and their entertainment provided carefully controlled spaces where these contradictory needs could be satisfied. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval entertainment served multiple functions that we've split among different institutions today. A single festival might serve as news broadcast, religious service, economic marketplace, and therapeutic intervention all at once. The traveling minstrel was simultaneously journalist, entertainer, and teacher. Their approach reminds us that entertainment wasn't separate from the serious business of life, but rather an essential component that made all other activities possible. Medieval entertainment demonstrates that people in every era find ways to create joy, beauty, and meaning, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. Their festivals and celebrations weren't desperate attempts to escape from harsh realities, but rather sophisticated strategies for engaging with those realities in ways that made life not just bearable, but actively worth living. So the next time you attend a festival, watch a performance, or participate in any form of communal entertainment, you might pause to appreciate the long tradition you're joining. The thread that connects a medieval village festival to a modern community celebration isn't just historical continuity, but the deeper human need for experiences that transcend daily struggles and connect us to something larger than ourselves. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the stranger corners of history. Until we meet again in another time and place, may your own entertainments bring you the same sense of community, wonder, and connection that sustained our medieval ancestors through both the darkness and the light of their remarkable world.